Before we begin this incredible story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss amazing stories like this one. Now, let's get started. Captain Rebecca Hayes stood in the back of the briefing room trying to be invisible. It was a skill she had perfected. Over her 8 years in the Air Force, being invisible meant avoiding the kind of attention. That led to uncomfortable questions about why she was still a captain after all these years, or why someone with her qualifications was stuck in a logistics office pushing papers. The briefing room was packed with officers from various units, all summoned for an emergency meeting. Nobody seemed to know what it was about, which made everyone nervous. The base commander, Colonel Morrison, entered the room and everyone snapped to attention. His face was grim, the kind of expression that meant bad news was coming. He told them to take their seats and began without preamble. An hour ago, a cargo plane carrying critical medical supplies and a team of civilian doctors had made an emergency landing at a remote airstrip 200 miles north. The plane had suffered catastrophic engine failure and was not flight-worthy. Worse, intelligence indicated that enemy forces were moving toward that airstrip. The doctors and crew needed immediate evacuation. The problem was simple but devastating. They had helicopters that could reach the airstrip, but the weather was deteriorating rapidly. High winds and a sandstorm were moving in, making helicopter flight extremely dangerous if not impossible. They needed a fixed-wing aircraft that could land on that short, rough airstrip, load everyone aboard, and take off again before the enemy arrived or the weather made flight completely impossible. The only aircraft on base capable of making that landing was a C-130 transport plane. But there was a problem. Colonel Morrison explained that their regular 100 to 130 pilots were all deployed or on leave. They had sent requests to neighboring bases, but every available pilot was committed to other urgent operations. The theater was stretched thin, and this rescue was not technically a combat operation, so it had low priority for resource allocation. Someone in the room asked about the civilian doctors. Who were they, and why did they matter? The colonel's jaw tightened. One of them was a heart surgeon who had just completed emergency surgery on the vice president's son, Marine stationed at another base. The political pressure to bring them home safely was immense. The room erupted in quiet conversations as officers discussed the impossible situation. Rebecca felt her heart pounding. She knew something that nobody else in this room knew. She could fly a C-130. Not just fly it, but land it on short, rough strips in bad weather. She had done it dozens of times. But that was in another life, a life she had tried to forget. Rebecca had been a pilot once, one of the best in her class. She had loved flying more than anything in the world. But that was before the incident, before the accident that had ended her flying career and left her grounded permanently. Colonel Morrison raised his voice over the chatter. He asked if there was anyone in the room, anyone at all, who had C-130 experience. The room fell silent. Officers looked at each other, but nobody spoke. Rebecca felt herself shrinking further into her chair. She couldn't volunteer. Her medical flight status was permanently grounded. Even if she wanted to help, regulations prohibited her from flying. It would be a court-martial offense. But then the colonel said something that changed everything. He said that those doctors had less than 4 hours before enemy forces reached the airstrip. After that, they would likely be captured or killed. Rebecca thought about those doctors, civilians who had volunteered to come to a war zone to save lives. She thought about the C-130 crew who had risked everything to fly them in and were now stranded. She thought about her own crew, the people she had lost in the accident that ended her career. They had died because she made a mistake, a split-second error in judgment that sent their plane into the ground. She had survived when they had not, and she had carried that guilt every day for 5 years. Maybe this was a chance to balance the scales, to save lives instead of losing them. Rebecca stood up slowly. The movement caught Colonel Morrison's attention. He looked at her, probably wondering who this captain was that he had never noticed before. Rebecca's voice was steady despite her racing heart. She said she had C-130 experience. The room turned to look at her. Dozens of eyes focused on the woman who had been invisible moments before. The colonel asked her, to state her name and qualifications. Rebecca took a breath and gave her name, then explained that she had flown C-130s for 3 years, logging over 800 hours including combat missions in Afghanistan. The colonel's expression shifted from surprise to hope. He asked why she was not listed on the pilot roster. Rebecca knew this moment was coming. She explained that she had been permanently grounded 5 years ago following an accident. Her medical flight status was revoked, and she had been reassigned to logistics. The hope in the colonel's face dimmed. He asked if she was medically cleared to fly now. Rebecca shook her head. She had never sought reinstatement. She had accepted the grounding as punishment for her mistake, as penance for the lives lost under her command. Colonel Morrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing options. Someone in the room pointed out that allowing a grounded pilot to fly violated multiple regulations. It could end both Rebecca's career and the colonel's. Another officer suggested they wait for a qualified pilot from another base, but the colonel shook his head. The timeline did not allow for waiting. It was either send Captain Hayes or abandon those people to their fate. The room fell silent as everyone processed the impossible choice. The colonel asked Rebecca a direct question. Could she make the flight? Not was she legally allowed to, but could she physically and mentally do it? Rebecca thought about the answer carefully. She had not touched a yoke in 5 years. She had not trusted herself to fly since the accident, but she also knew that flying was like breathing for her. It was instinct and muscle memory and something deeper that never truly left. She looked the colonel in the eye and said yes, she could make the flight. She could bring those people home. Colonel Morrison made his decision. He said that in a combat theater under emergency conditions, he had the authority to override certain peacetime regulations. He was temporarily reinstating Captain Hayes to flight status for this single mission. The legal consequences would be dealt with later. Right now, people needed rescue, and she was their only option. He asked if she was willing to volunteer. Rebecca felt tears threatening, but pushed them back. She said she was willing. The colonel nodded and told her to get to the flight line. They were wheels up in 30 minutes. Rebecca practically ran to the hangar, where the C-130 was being prepped. The loadmaster, a sergeant named Torres, looked surprised to see a logistics officer claiming to be their pilot. Rebecca showed him her old flight wings that she still carried in her pocket, a talisman from better days. She asked for the aircraft status and weather reports. Torres, sensing her competence despite his confusion, quickly brought her up to speed. The plane was fueled and ready. The weather was bad and getting worse. They had a narrow window to make this work. Rebecca climbed into the cockpit and her hands moved automatically to familiar positions. The seat felt right despite the years away. She began the pre-flight checklist from memory, her fingers dancing over switches and controls. Everything came back to her as if she had flown yesterday. But underneath the competence was a tremor of fear. What if she froze? What if the memories of the crash overwhelmed her at a critical moment? What if she made another mistake and killed more people? She forced the thoughts away. There was no room for doubt now. People were counting on her. The co-pilot's seat remained empty. There was no qualified co-pilot available on such short notice. Rebecca would be flying solo, which was technically possible but far from ideal. Torres appeared beside her and said he had some flight training from years ago, nothing official, but he knew the basics. It was not much, but Rebecca accepted gratefully. She showed him what instruments to monitor and what to do in an emergency. Torres listened intently, and Rebecca saw no fear in his eyes, only determination. If she could be brave, so could he. They rolled out of the hangar into deteriorating weather. The wind was already gusting hard enough to rock the aircraft. Sand was starting to fill the air, reducing visibility. Rebecca contacted the tower and received clearance for immediate takeoff. The tower operator wished her luck, his voice carrying an undertone that said she would need it. Rebecca advanced the throttles and felt the powerful engines respond. The C-130 accelerated down the runway, and for the first time in 5 years, Rebecca pulled back on the yoke and lifted an aircraft into the sky. The moment the wheels left the ground, something inside Rebecca shifted. The fear did not disappear, but it became manageable. This was what she was born to do. The aircraft responded to her touch, like an extension of her own body. She climbed through the turbulence with smooth corrections, reading the air and adjusting for each gust of wind. Torres watched her with growing confidence. Whatever had grounded her, it was not lack of skill. Rebecca set course for the remote airstrip. Knowing that the hard part was yet to come, the flight took 90 minutes through increasingly difficult conditions. The sandstorm was tracking with them, a massive wall of brown and orange that consumed the horizon. Rebecca flew at low altitude to stay beneath the worst of the winds, navigating by instruments and GPS. She tried not to think about what would happen if they encountered enemy fire. The C-130 was not a combat aircraft. It was slow and vulnerable. They would be an easy target for anyone with a surface-to-air missile. All they could do was hope that the enemy forces had not yet reached the airstrip. Torres spotted the airstrip first. A thin line of cleared earth in the middle of nowhere. Rebecca saw why regular pilots had hesitated to attempt this landing. The strip was short, barely long enough for a C-130 under perfect conditions. The surface looked rough, probably damaged by neglect and weather. There were no lights, no control tower, nothing but empty desert. Rebecca circled once, assessing the approach. The wind was gusting crossways to the runway, which would make the landing even more challenging. She heard doubt creeping into her mind again. This was how the accident had started, the difficult landing in bad conditions. Rebecca pushed the memories away and focused on the present. She lined up for final approach, reducing speed and lowering flaps. The C-130 bucked and yawed in the turbulent air. Rebecca made constant corrections, keeping the aircraft aligned with the strip. Torres called out altitude and airspeed, his voice steady. They were committed now. There was no going around for another attempt. The fuel margins were too tight and the weather was too bad. This landing had to work the first time or not at all. The wheels touched down hard. Rebecca immediately deployed the thrust reversers. The aircraft shook violently as it decelerated. Rebecca fought to keep it centered on the rough strip. A gust of wind tried to push them sideways, but she corrected with rudder and brake. The C-130 slowed and stopped, and Rebecca finally allowed herself to breathe. They were down. They had made it. Torres let out a whoop of celebration, and Rebecca smiled despite herself. One part of the mission was complete. Now they had to load everyone and take off again before either the enemy or the storm arrived. The stranded crew and doctors emerged from a small shelter near the airstrip. Rebecca counted 12 people total, more than she had expected. They looked exhausted and frightened, but immensely relieved to see the rescue plane. The cargo plane's pilot, a major named Stevens, ran up to Rebecca's window. He asked who had been crazy enough to fly in these conditions. Rebecca introduced herself, and Stevens' eyes widened when he realized it grounded. Logistics officer had just pulled off one of the most difficult landings he had ever seen. There would be time for explanations later. Right now, they needed to move. Torres and the flight crew worked quickly to load everyone aboard. The doctors carried medical bags and equipment they refused to leave behind. Rebecca understood. That equipment could save lives. But every pound of weight made the takeoff more difficult. She did quick calculations in her head, figuring the maximum weight she could lift off this short strip in these conditions. They were going to be right at the edge of the aircraft's performance envelope. There was no margin for error. While the loading continued, Rebecca monitored the radio. She picked up chatter in a language she did not understand, but the tone was clear. Enemy forces were close and getting closer. She could see dust clouds in the distance that might be vehicles approaching. They had minutes, not hours. Rebecca called back to Torres and told him they needed to leave immediately. Torres acknowledged and started securing cargo and passengers. The doctors protested that they needed more time, but Stevens firmly told them they were out of time. Get strapped in or get left behind. Rebecca started the engines and began her flight. Checks even before everyone was fully secured. She felt the weight of the aircraft heavier than she wanted, but not quite overloaded. The wind had increased, howling across the desert and rocking the plane. Sand was reducing visibility to less than a quarter mile. Rebecca calculated the takeoff distance needed versus the runway available. The numbers were not good. Under normal conditions, she would abort this takeoff as too risky. But conditions were not normal. Staying on the ground meant certain capture or death. Torres appeared in the cockpit and strapped into the co-pilot seat. He looked at Rebecca with complete trust and asked what he could do to help. Rebecca appreciated that trust more than he knew. She told him to watch the engine instruments and call out any anomalies. Then she said something she had not said in 5 years. She said a prayer, asking for the strength to do this right and the skill to bring everyone home safely. Torres quietly added his own prayer. Then Rebecca released the brakes and pushed the throttles forward. The C-130 accelerated slowly. Too slowly. The rough runway and heavy weight fought against every foot of progress. Rebecca held the yoke steady, resisting the urge to rotate early. Pulling up too soon would cause a stall. They needed every bit of speed they could get. The end of the runway rushed toward them impossibly fast. Torres called out the speed, his voice tight with tension. They were approaching decision speed, the point where Rebecca had to either commit to takeoff or abort. But there was nowhere to abort to. They were committed the moment they started rolling. Rebecca pulled back on the yoke at the last possible second. The C-130 lifted off with mere feet of runway remaining. The aircraft struggled to climb, wallowing in ground effect. Rebecca carefully raised the landing gear and flaps at precise moments, balancing airspeed and climb rate. A downdraft hit them, pushing the aircraft toward the ground. Rebecca compensated, but they dropped to within 50 feet of the desert floor. For a terrible moment, she thought they would not make it. Then the C-130 found its rhythm and began to climb. They were flying. They were going to make it home. The return flight was tense but uneventful. Rebecca navigated through the sandstorm using instruments alone, unable to see anything outside the cockpit windows. The aircraft handled well despite the turbulence, and Rebecca's confidence grew with each mile. She had done it. She had overcome her fear and her past to save 12 lives. The guilt she had carried for 5 years felt lighter somehow. Nothing could bring back her lost crew, but she had honored their memory by ensuring others did not share their fate. Torres asked her about the accident, about what had happened to ground her. Rebecca hesitated, then decided he deserved to know. 5 years ago, she had been approaching a landing in Afghanistan. Weather was bad, visibility was poor. She had made a judgment call to continue the approach when she should have gone around. The aircraft crashed short of the runway. 3 crew members died. Rebecca survived with minor injuries. The investigation concluded that pilot error was the primary cause. Rebecca's flight status was revoked, and she was reassigned to a desk job. She had not fought the decision. She believed she deserved it. Torres listened quietly, then asked a question that surprised her. He asked if she had learned from the mistake. Rebecca said, yes, absolutely. She had studied that accident 1,000 times, understood exactly what she did wrong and why. Torres nodded and said, then she was a better pilot now than she was before. Mistakes teach us, if we let them. The real tragedy would be wasting that knowledge by never flying again. Rebecca had not thought about it that way. She had viewed her grounding as righteous punishment. Torres was suggesting it might have been a waste of talent and experience. They landed back at base 2 hours later. The sandstorm had arrived in full force, making the landing challenging but not impossible. Rebecca greased it, touching down so smoothly that Torres barely felt the wheels contact the runway. As they taxied to the hangar, Rebecca could see a crowd gathered. News of the rescue had spread. She shut down the engines and sat for a moment in the sudden quiet. Torres unbuckled and offered his hand. He said it was an honor to fly with her. Rebecca shook his hand, feeling emotion welling up that she had suppressed for years. Colonel Morrison was waiting when she climbed out of the aircraft. His expression was unreadable. He asked her to come with him to his office. Rebecca followed, expecting the worst. She had violated regulations by flying while grounded. The colonel could court-martial her, discharge her, end her career completely. She had known the risks when she volunteered, and she would accept the consequences. But at least those 12 people were safe. That was worth whatever punishment came next. In his office, the colonel gestured for her to sit. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. He said he had reviewed her file, including the accident report from 5 years ago. He had also spoken with several pilots who knew her before the accident. They all said the same thing. Rebecca Hayes was an exceptional pilot who made one mistake on a bad day. She had been punished far beyond what the mistake warranted. The grounding had been excessive, possibly even vindictive. Pushed by an investigating officer who had his own biases about women in combat roles, Rebecca was stunned. She had never questioned the grounding, never appealed the decision. She had accepted it as deserved. The colonel continued. He said that effective immediately, he was recommending her for full flight status reinstatement. The rescue mission demonstrated clearly that she was fit to fly. More than that, she had displayed courage and skill under pressure that exceeded most pilots on this base. She would need to pass a flight evaluation and a medical review, but those were formalities. If she wanted to fly again, she could. Rebecca could not speak for a moment. Flying again? Returning to the cockpit permanently. It was everything she had wanted but never dared to hope for. She finally found her voice and asked why the colonel was doing this. He smiled slightly and said, "Because good pilots were rare and great pilots were even rarer. The Air Force could not afford to waste someone like her on paperwork. Also, those doctors she rescued had been very vocal about their gratitude. One of them had already called a senator. The political pressure was now in her favor rather than against her. Sometimes, the colonel said, the system gets it right by accident." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Rebecca underwent a thorough medical evaluation that found no reason she should not fly. The examining doctor noted that the original grounding seemed to be based more on psychological concerns than physical ones. And those concerns appeared to have been resolved. Rebecca passed her flight evaluation with scores that impressed even the crusty old instructor pilot who administered it. He told her she flew like someone who had never stopped, like the controls were part of her body. It was meant as a compliment, though Rebecca privately thought he had no idea how accurate that assessment was. Her reinstatement became official on a Tuesday morning. Colonel Morrison presented her with new flight wings in a small ceremony attended by Torres and the crew from the rescue mission. The doctors she had saved sent a video message thanking her for her courage and skill. One of them, the heart surgeon, said that Rebecca had given them a second chance at life, and they would not waste it. Rebecca felt her eyes tearing up. For 5 years she had viewed herself as someone who had taken lives through incompetence. Now she could begin to see herself as someone who saved lives through competence. Rebecca returned to flying C-130s full-time. She discovered that she loved it even more than she remembered. Every takeoff was a gift, every landing a small victory. She volunteered for the difficult missions, the ones in bad weather or to challenging locations. Other pilots noticed that Captain Hayes never backed down from a tough assignment. Some thought she was reckless. Those who flew with her knew better. She was not reckless. She was simply unwilling to let fear control her decisions. She had faced her worst nightmare and flown through it. 6 months after the rescue mission, Rebecca was promoted to major. The promotion board noted her exceptional performance and her rescue of 12 personnel under hazardous conditions. She was also awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the highest honors for aviation achievement. At the medal ceremony, Rebecca thought about her lost crew from 5 years ago. She hoped they would be proud of her, proud that she had not let their deaths be the end of her story. She had survived when they had not, and she owed it to them to make that survival mean something. The story of her rescue mission spread beyond her base. Other pilots heard about the logistics officer who stepped forward when no one else could, who landed a C-130 on an impossible strip in a sandstorm and brought everyone home. Some versions of the story were exaggerated, giving her almost superhuman abilities. Rebecca tried to downplay the dramatization. She had simply done her job, she said. But others disagreed. Doing your job when it is easy is not heroism. Doing your job when you are terrified, when regulations say you should not, when failure means death, that is heroism. Rebecca received a letter one day from the widow of one of her crew members who died in the accident. The woman said she had heard about Rebecca's rescue mission. She wanted Rebecca to know that her husband would have been proud. He had always believed in Rebecca's abilities as a pilot. His death was not Rebecca's fault. It was an accident, a terrible accident, but not murder or incompetence. The woman said she hoped Rebecca could forgive herself and move forward. The letter broke something open inside Rebecca that had been locked tight for years. She cried for the first time since the accident, finally allowing herself to grieve rather than just feel guilt. Years later, Rebecca would retire from the Air Force as a lieutenant colonel with over 3,000 flight hours. She would train new pilots, passing on the lessons she learned from both her successes and her failures. She would tell them that courage is not the absence of fear, but action despite fear. She would tell them that mistakes do not define you unless you let them. And she would tell them about the day she stood in a briefing room trying to be invisible, and how stepping forward into visibility changed everything. But on quiet nights, Rebecca would sometimes sit in her backyard and look up at the stars. She would remember the feeling of the yoke in her hands, the sound of the engines, the moment when the wheels left the ground and Earth fell away. She would remember Colonel Morrison asking if anyone had C-130 experience, and the silence that followed. She would remember standing up, making herself visible, accepting the risk, and she would smile, knowing that the best decision she ever made was deciding to fly again, to trust herself again, to believe that redemption was possible. The room had gone silent when she stepped forward, silenced by surprise and doubt. But she had proven them wrong. She had proven herself wrong. And in doing so, she had found her way back to the sky where she belonged.